Alright, so today we are going to talk about the creation and ratification of the Constitution. In our last section of notes, we talked about the critical period. And again, the critical period was the time in which the Articles of Confederation was our founding document. This is the first Constitution that we have, and it was, the best way to put it is the quote from your political cartoon. It was rough sailing ahead. There are a lot of issues with the Articles of Confederation. For example, there was no executive branch of government to enforce the laws. There was a judicial branch to interpret the laws. There was the Congress did not have the power to tax the people. There was no revenue for the government to be able to function and serve the needs of the people. We could go on and on. But basically what it came down to was the framers realized we need to create something else. This isn't a document that we can correct and fix. We need to start all over. And so they basically throw out the articles and they start drafting the Constitution. And what you're going to see throughout this set of notes is that a lot of compromises had to be made in order to get to a document that everyone could get behind or stand behind. Alright, so to get us started, a little background. The Revolutionary War had ended. Virginia Patriot James Madison, he worked in Congress, and he tried very hard to get the states to work together. He did fail at doing that. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, Congress had tried to unite the states under one nation. Members of Congress feared that a strong central government would crush the rights they were fighting to preserve. And so essentially this is right after we win our independence, and we have to create our government. We have to figure out what we want that government to look like. And so many colonists were afraid of repeating our mistakes. We didn't want the central government to be too powerful like it was with Great Britain. And so they don't give much power to the central government, not even the power to tax the people. And so this plan of government was called the Articles of Confederation, and it failed. Okay, so Articles of Confederation, again, there was no president, one legislative branch, and from that legislative branch, there was a presiding officer that was chosen to kind of lead. No main central government, one member of Congress per state, so not very many representatives. This is a very small republic. States had all of the power. They even had the power to make their own currency, to regulate trade, which caused a lot of tension between states. Congress had the ability to enforce their own law. Shays Rebellion. So with the Shays Rebellion, basically what happens here, Daniel Shays, he's a former American officer. He leads an uprising in Massachusetts against the economic conditions. He was a farmer, and he is in serious debt, and they are putting him in jail because he is in debt. And so this was kind of his response to that. States were very slow to respond to local and national level. And proved the Articles of Confederation was weak. And now essentially what happened here is it was very difficult for the government to put down the rebellion, simply because they could not draft men into war. They did not have a military per se, so it was difficult to bring men in to put this rebellion down, and it took too long. And so we realized we have to have a stronger central government. We have to be able to draft men into war. We have to be able to raise our own army in order to protect not only ourselves against foreign powers, but also protect ourselves from each other. All right, Philadelphia Convention. So at the Philadelphia Convention, a group of delegates known as the Framers came together to recommend revisions to the Articles of Confederation. So again, as we go into this convention, the thought process still is, let's just fix it. We don't need a new document. However, once they started to talk amongst themselves, look over the document, look over the issues of the document, they realized we have to start over. We have to start from scratch, and we have to create a new government. The framers of the Constitution, many had fought in the Revolution. 39 had been members of the Continental Congress or Confederation, or both. 8 had served in constitutional conventions in their own states. 7 had been state governors. 9 had signed the Declaration of Independence. 31 had attended college. 2 college presidents, 3 professors, and 20 would later become part of the government in some way. And so these men were very experienced and educated. This group, the framers that were working to draft the Constitution, were also known as the demigods. And also James Madison, interestingly, was known as the father of the Constitution. George Washington was among this group as well, and he actually becomes the president of this group. And also, for these meetings, they decided they wanted to keep the information secret, that they didn't want any information to be leaked. They didn't want any outside pressures or political pressures as they worked through this process and determined how our government would function. And so again, they kept the meeting a secret. So in the summer heat, in May 25th, 1787, the Constitutional Convention met for the first time in the East Room of Pennsylvania State House. This was later called Independence Hall. This was also where the Declaration was written 11 years earlier, and they drafted the Constitution. All right, so issue, how should the states be represented in the new government? This was one of the main issues where the framers disagreed, and we started to see a divide. Most delegates initially believed that they were there to revise the Articles of Confederation, and they almost felt like it was, wrong to even think of replacing it, and it was almost unlawful. Virginia delegates presented a new plan of government. After much debate, it was decided to throw out the Articles of Confederation and write a new constitution. The delegates, later known as the framers, were divided on where the government should get its power to rule. Madison's answer was in the Virginia plan and said the government's power should come directly from the people. All right, so here were the two different plans. Some of the framers supported the Virginia plan and some supported the New Jersey plan. With the Virginia plan, this was considered, or also known as, the large state plan, and that was simply because many large states were in support of the Virginia plan. With the Virginia plan, the legislative branch would have 2 chambers, so it would be bicameral. Both chambers use population to determine representatives, and that's why large states were in such big support of this plan, because that meant that they would have more representatives in the government because they were larger states, because it was based on population. How many people were living in that state determined how many representatives there would be. This was written by James Madison, and also within this plan there would be a system of checks and balances and 3 branches of government. With the New Jersey plan, this was a small state plan, again because most small states supported this plan. This would be a single-body legislature. It would be unicameral, 1 house, equal representation in Congress. So no matter how small or how big a state was, they would have equal representation. They would elect a federal executive over the entire government and create federal judicial branch as well. Most of the power stayed in the states. Here's the chart to kind of show the two sides and then also show the Great Compromise, which was basically that ultimate decision that was made to kind of find some sort of compromise between these two plans. So with the Great Compromise, what they ultimately decided to do is combine the two plans, which is such a great idea. So we would have 1 house, we would have a legislative branch that was bicameral, 2 houses, with one side, the Senate, this would be based on equality, meaning there would be 2 representatives from every state that would represent their states in government, and they would be part of the Senate. No matter how big, how small, every state had 2. On the other house, the House of Representatives, this would be based on population. And so it would depend on how big your state was, or at least that would be factored in, and help to decide how many representatives would be in your, or be representing from your state. Okay, so here are a few more compromises that had to be made while these framers were drafting the Constitution. So with the Connecticut Compromise, they agreed that Congress should be 2 houses. Smaller Senate would have equal representation, 2 per state, and then in the House, representation would be based on state population. Delegates would place very few limits on Congress's power to regulate commerce. Southerners succeed in banning Congress from taxing imports, and Native Americans are not foreign nations or part of separate states. 3/5 compromise, and sorry, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, I'm running out of time. Should slaves count in the population? And what they ultimately decided was for every 5 slaves, 3 would be counted towards representation and taxation. And the South really just wanted them to be counted towards representation and not taxation, where the North was ultimately wanting slavery to be abolished. But again, this was kind of the compromise that for every, again, 5 slaves, 3 would be counted towards representation. Northern states got 3/5 direct tax levied by Congress, therefore South got more people, but had to pay more taxes. This was abolished with the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in 1865. Commerce and slave trade compromise. Southern states were afraid of export taxes on tobacco and cotton, export meaning out of the country, and on slave trade becoming forbidden. Southern states got their compromise for Congress to not touch either subject for at least 20 years. Okay, and then we had 2 sides. As we are, done drafting the Constitution, we've got 2 different groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were big supporters of the Constitution. They wanted a strong centralized government. They favored dividing power among the different branches of government. They supported the checks and balances. They believed this would keep us from a tyranny. They proposed a single person to lead the executive branch, supported removing some powers from the states, and they write the Federalist Papers to try to convince the people to support the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, they wanted more state power. They wanted the legislative branch to have more power than the executive. They feared a strong executive government might become like a king or tyrant like they had seen in Great Britain, believed in the Bill of Rights, and they believed in people's liberties, and they believed they needed to be protected under the Bill of Rights. And so that was essentially the compromise that was made. The Federalists said, we don't feel like we need a Bill of Rights, but we will create the Bill of Rights and add it to the Constitution if the Anti-Federalists will then support the Constitution and help it become our founding document. And essentially that's what they agreed upon. All right, for ratification of the Constitution, 9 out of 13 states needed to pass a law to accept the Constitution as a law of the land. Delaware was the first state to ratify, and New Hampshire was the 9th state to ratify. Under Article 7, that should have brought the Constitution into effect, but it actually did not. The Virginia ratification. After fierce debate, Virginia voted to adopt the Constitution, with Jefferson reluctantly supporting and George Washington throwing his full support. Virginia ratified the Constitution. New York. The public battle to decide on the Constitution created one of the most remarkable newspaper campaigns, the Federalist Papers. This included